Welcome to Vancouver Rape Relief's 2020 Montreal Massacre Memorial. This year we have been hosting a series of 12 online events, and you can find the full program on our website at rapereliefshelter.bc.ca. We are live on Facebook and on Zoom for today's event, Abolition of Prostitution, International Feminist Overview, Part 2. My name is Sophia, and I am a frontline worker and collective member of Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter, and I will be hosting today's panel. I want to remind you about the data on prostitution that we recently published. You can find it on our website. It reinforces all of that we know already about women's experiences in prostitution, such as that 48% of the women who call us have had a pimp, and we know that 65% of the women who call us are dependent on drugs and alcohol. So it reinforces what we know about women's lives in prostitution. Last week, we heard from Jean Enriquez from the Philippines, Tegan Laren from Australia, and Ali Marie Diamond from New Zealand, as well as my fellow collective member, Hilla Kerner, about their respective fights to end prostitution. Today, we again have the opportunity to hear from our panelists about the prostitution laws and legal frameworks in their respective countries, the application of these laws, the situation of women in prostitution, and the work each woman is doing to work towards the abolition of prostitution. I am joined by Ingeborg Kraus of the German Psychotraumatologist Against Prostitution in Germany, Elisa Bernard of the Organization for Prostitution Survivors in the US, Gada Jabour of CAFA based in Lebanon, and Diane Matt of La Concertation de lutte contre l'exploitation sexuelle, La Clé in Quebec. We will be taking questions from the audience through Zoom and Facebook Live after the panel as well. And if I can just remind you to send your questions to all the panelists and attendees so everyone can kind of see the discussion. That would be much appreciated. So we will start with a 10 to 15 minute presentation from each of our panelists. As a reminder, please introduce yourself and your organization, give us an overview of the current prostitution laws in your country and how they are applied, as well as what kinds of social programs or economic support and exiting services might be available to women in the countries that you work in. Ingeborg, we can start with you. I'll just ask you to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. And yes, I will start with a little presentation. It will take not longer than 15 minutes, because if you see picture, it becomes clearer what with what we have to deal in Germany. Just a couple of words about myself. My name is Ingeborg Kraus. I have a counseling office here, and I'm a psychotraumatologist. And 6 years ago, I created the network called Trauma and Prostitution. It's a network of health experts all over Germany who offer women in prostitution, but not only, but also therapeutical and medical assistance. We want to abolish prostitution, and we want to inform about the reality in prostitution and the negative impact on health. So, I think I will. Can you see, no. Can you see my PowerPoint now? Okay. So Germany has legalized prostitution in 2002. What means that since then it is treated as a job as any other. Women are seen as sex workers and should have the same rights as workers or somebody who runs a business. With this law, the politicians wanted to strengthen the women as best as possible. from bad working conditions. And I repeat this because it's important, you know, all over the world, everybody wants to help women in prostitution and help them to get them out of bad working conditions. I want to show you today, you know, what the outcomes of it was. Of course, pimping became allowed. Only the exploitative pimping is a criminal offense in Germany. So only if a pimp takes more than 50% income from the woman. So try, imagine, you know, in front of the police, try to prove it. It's nearly impossible. So what are the outcome of this law 18 years after it? The decriminalization of the profiteers of the system has contributed to an explosion of the demand. I use this word explosion because it's really like this. We are talking about 1.2 million men buying sex every day, and we have a population of 18 million people. So, you know, make the count. Nearly every fourth man is buying sex in Germany, and prostitution has increased at least up to 30% since then. So we witnessed the creation of mega brothels with the capacity to accommodate around 1,000 sex buyers at once and even more. This is the brothel called Pascha in Köln. And during the lockdown in Germany, they get state support. And the women got nothing. So this is also the outcome of legalizing prostitution. Flat rate brothels were created where for 70 euros you get offered a beer, sausage, and unlimited women. So 3 years ago, you know, after 15 years thinking, you know, the politician realized that this is against human dignity. So they said, okay, flat rate brothels are not allowed anymore. But today, you know, this is legal. You have drinks as much as you want, and a woman for 49 euros. Okay, this is a little bit better, but this is not the solution. 3,500 brothels are registered, are officially registered. The profit of this business is enormous. We're talking about 15 billion of euros of direct transaction every year. It has become an important industrial sector where women's bodies are objectified and used as commodities. This economical model of prostitution has also led to an economical exploitation of the women. They earn 30 euros approximately for sexual intercourse, while they must pay around 160 euros for a room and 25 euros taxes per day. So they have to serve 6 men before starting earning money. These women are subjected to the rules of a free market of capitalism at its roughest. Their bodies are exploited to the maximum. Many among them lead a nomad life, moving from one city to the next and one brothel to the next, and offer the sex buyers variety. So one question was, what is the behavior of the sex buyers? A friend of mine listed, it was 6 years ago, what was offered in several brothels. What kind of sexual services were offered, and she looked in several brothels and she found this list. When I was in Vancouver, I showed you this. I counted in total 28 sexual services, and 3 years ago group sex is not allowed anymore, and having sex without a condom is not allowed anymore. But when you look today in one brothel in my hometown, I can find even more sexual services that are legal. In an exclusive brothels, I have found 32 legal sexual services. You are still allowed to, I'm sorry to say that, to piss in the face of a woman or to shit on her. So those regulations 3 years ago, I mean, they cannot be taken serious. This is a so-called juicer who is still allowed today. A woman is literally used as a pissoir. So one man stands one next to the other and do this. The makeup of the women in prostitution has changed since 2002. Today, around 90% of the women come from other countries, mainly the poorest regions of Europe. Germany has become a hub for human trafficking and forced prostitution, and 30% of these women are under 21 years old. The majority do not speak German. So the politicians, as I said, realized that they have done something wrong. And since July 2017, we have a new law called Prostitution Protection Law, where some regulations are being implemented. Women, for example, in prostitution have to register and they get a whore passport. So you can imagine that nobody wants that. Only 10% registered, and less than 100 women out of 400,000 at least are self-employed and have a social security. The majority stays unregistered. So, and this is important for everybody and the politicians who think to legalize prostitution. The main goal that wanted to bring the women out of the darkness has totally failed. It cannot be more failed than this. Men, also men have to use condoms since 2017, but you just have to look into a sex buyer forums and you get hundreds proofs a day that they don't use it. And women have to have a home outside the brothel, but we know that since the Corona lockdown, many women became homeless from one day to the other. So are there social programs, economic support and exit services? After nearly 20 years handling prostitution as a job, the counseling centers for prostituted people have not developed adequate qualifications to support and help women to exit prostitution. They have cooperated with the brothel keepers, that distributed condoms and hygiene kits, but that's all. And like in Frankfurt, they even offered guided brothel tours. Yes. To people, for tourists. And just a couple of meters outside the door, you have women lying who are drug addicted. And those officers are financed by the state. There are other programs, self-financed, who are doing a good job, like Solvodi, but they are flooded with work and are struggling with financing their program. Corona has made visible where prostitution leads the women into nothing. After the first lockdown, approximately 80% left Germany. They were driven back to their home country by their pimps, or they took a bus home alone. Some didn't even have enough money to pay their trip back. So it is clear that third parts were mainly profiting out of prostitution, but not the women. The money went into the pockets of the brothel keepers, pimps, traffickers, and the German state. The women who stayed in Germany, many of them became homeless from one day to the other and without any savings. They are now criminalized, and many didn't have access to legal status to get economical support because they were not registered. Prostitution stayed in the darkness even after 18 years of legalization. The brothel keeper gets state support on the other hand. Why? Because they're considered as businessmen. So this law was a brothel keeper, pimp, and sex buyer protection law. During Corona, sex buyers are criminalized in only 3 or 4 towns in Germany. But nobody implemented it. The police has no experience with a sex purchase ban and hasn't done no investigation about it. Not only with that, but because it is said that prostitution is a job, they have no experience with identifying forced prostitution. It is assumed that at least 170,000 people are victims of trafficking in Germany. The police recorded only 430 victims of sexual exploitation in 2018. So the police and the public prosecutors became helpless and blind towards forced prostitution with this law. Yeah, this was it. This was my short presentation.
Yeah, it's not surprising that the state abandoned women during the pandemic, that considering they already abandoned women to prostitution, and your presentations always remind us of how dangerous legalization is for women and women's equality. So thank you very much. Next on the screen, I have Gada.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be with you all. I didn't time my presentation, so Sophia, please jump in to say that my time is over. So my name is Gada Jabour. I am one of the co-founders of CAFA, a Lebanese feminist organization working on combating violence against women. I'm the head of the anti-trafficking, anti-exploitation unit at CAFA. And at this unit, we very briefly, I'll present the work of the unit. We work on 3 levels of intervention. One, it's service provision to women in prostitution. And here we operate a helpline and a shelter for women in prostitution. And we are present at the Central Detention Police Center, where women are arrested for prostitution-related charges. When it comes to the second level of intervention is about building public education and building an opinion against prostitution in Lebanon as a form of violence against women. I have to say that CAFA is the only abolitionist organization in Lebanon, and the topic as such, the topic of prostitution, is not discussed among NGOs and among governmental organizations. So the burden is on us at CAFA to open the topic, maintain the debate, explain about the realities of women in prostitution, explain about the entitlements and the privilege and practices of sex buyers, and build an abolitionist movement. When we do public educations, we target the public at large, but also we target specific groups, particularly humanitarian actors and police officers. And I have to say that changing the narratives, the mentalities, and the law is a long way in Lebanon because, as I said, the topic is not open yet on a large scale. And it is related also to the overall women's status in Lebanon. You cannot separate prostitution from domestic violence issues, for example. And in Lebanon, the situation of women, for example, to give you an idea about the status of women, child marriage is still legal in Lebanon. Family laws are still religious in Lebanon, and women are put in a position of subordination to men in the family. They lose custody, they cannot ask for divorce, there's nothing called marital rape, etc. So the whole I mean, the issues cannot be separated, and it's going to take time to change the narratives around prostitution. And of course, the third level of intervention, because CAFA is a service provision organization, but also, and basically an advocacy organization, we are pushing for abolition in Lebanon, and repealing, I mean, annulling all the policies and laws that discriminate against women in prostitution. To talk a little bit about the legal framework, so in one word, they're anti-women. We used to have, before 1977, we used to have a legal framework that regularized prostitution. It was created in 1931 under the French mandate. So basically, we took the French law and adopted it in Lebanon. It was imposed by the French mandate. And of course, the rationale was that the French soldiers would need access to women bodies, but they wanted to have as well certain protection from diseases. So the law was imported from France until 1977. And during this year, Lebanon shifted from a regularized model to a prohibitionist model, where all forms of prostitution are criminalized, and basically what's criminalized is the women who are engaged in prostitution, the pimps, and those who live off from the earnings of women. But of course, sex buyers are not mentioned. The current situation in Lebanon is really a bit vague and contradictory, because on one hand, we have this law that says that there shouldn't be prostitution in Lebanon, and the rationale is, of course, moralistic. And on the other hand, we see that the government runs a visa scheme called the artist visa, through which thousands of migrant women are recruited to Lebanon to work in the super nightclub industry, which is the strip club and prostitution industry in Lebanon. And it's a form of scheme really that is regulated by the immigration authorities in Lebanon. And they recruit women under the pretext of dancers or servers, bartenders, but it's the red light district in Lebanon that is operated via government. In practice, what's happening is that women are being penalized, they're being arrested. Very few pimps are being caught and prosecuted. And the anti-trafficking law that was adopted in 2011 through a lot of pressure from the US government on Lebanon to pass a law, did not serve to change the reality at all. It's a law, the anti-trafficking law did not even protect the trafficking victims. It is not enforced, and it has many loopholes when it comes to protection issues. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you heard about the big sex trafficking network that was arrested in Lebanon in 2016. It's called Chez Maurice Network. It's a network that involved a large number of Syrian women in Lebanon, refugees, and it was covered by local and international media because the traffickers were severely beating and torturing the women in prostitution. So even in this case, Lebanon was not able to protect the victims of this particular trafficking network. All what they did is that they did not arrest the women, but nothing, zero assistance was provided to these women, not even a residency permit, which is the first step towards protecting victims. And of course, as I said, sex buyers, they are granted impunity in terms of they're not, the law does not mention them, and therefore buying sex is not punishable. And it's covered. I mean, they have the green light by the society as well to purchase as much as they want, to the point that since it's not illegal, the police would send undercover sex buyers, whether officials or civilians, to arrest women in prostitution. And usually what happens, and that's what women tell us, is that the police officers or the undercover agent would sleep with the woman, then arrest her. And of course, the police does not see any problem in this because buying sex is not illegal. In terms of services in Lebanon, as I said, because the topic is not open, there are no services. And anyway, in all cases, the government in Lebanon has a very poor policy in supporting victims of violence in general. So the burden is on NGOs and charities to do that work of protection and basic assistance to women in need or victims of violence. And the few that are, I mean, of course, there's CAFA, there are some other organizations that provide some assistance and daily activities. But most of these organizations that do have some programs around prostitution are specific to HIV, sexually transmitted diseases. So they fall under the harm reduction approach, not under the elimination of harm approach that we carry at CAFA. And what makes things even worse is that international organizations, UN agencies operating in Lebanon, and they are a lot, because Lebanon has a big, for example, refugee situation in Lebanon. So there are a lot of actors in Lebanon, and these actors do not consider, they don't have prostitution on their agenda at all, and not among their priorities. And when they talk about prostitution, it's within the ceiling of trafficking, within the framework of trafficking. So basically there is a separation, like in the US context, there is a complete separation between sex trafficking and prostitution. And this is very harmful in terms of women accessing services, in terms of the debate, and in terms of any legal reform, because the mentality is only targeting those who are in the extreme form of exploitation, and that's not reality. I was surprised by when Ingeborg said that 50%, the formula, the equation of 50%, because some police officers, when we train them, they have this, they tell us that if it's less than 50%, it's okay. But if it's more, then we think there's some sort of exploitation. Of course, this is ridiculous. And I thought that this is something that they created themselves. I was surprised that in Germany, they have also the same formula. So basically, when it comes to services, women are left alone to face the harms of prostitution when they are in the life, and two, to exit if they wish to exit. So there's a big need for SGBV service providers, organizations to step up and recognize this as a form of violence, so that it becomes part of the priorities and services provided in Lebanon. This is basic, and this is what is CAFA, the plan of CAFA is to, we just issued a research on the needs assessment study on the of Lebanese and Syrian women in prostitution. And our plan is to put pressure on actors, frontliners, to take up this issue, because they cannot separate gender-based violence from prostitution. So that's the next step for CAFA in Lebanon. Thank you, and I hope I didn't go overboard.
Perfect timing, exactly perfect. Yeah, great presentation. At Vancouver Rape Relief, we work with women who've experienced all types of violence as well, and see the connections between wife assault and prostitution and sexual assault and rape. They can't be disentangled from issues of women's equality. Also, of course, we can see how trafficking laws don't actually address women in trafficking either, and instead abandon all women to prostitution. So thank you very much for reinforcing that. Next up, we have Diane from Le Clay.
So I'm Diane Matt from Clay, based in Montreal in Quebec. I'm a feminist organizer. I'm a firm believer that in order to attain equality, we have to get rid of men's violence against women. Otherwise, there will never be equality for all women. I'm a firm believer as well that prostitution is one of the 4 patriarchal institutions that control women's bodies and women's sexuality, which is prostitution, maternity, marriage, and heterosexuality. And I think that we have to fight prostitution as a mean to really challenge and confront men's entitlement in our societies. I'm also one of founder of the CLE, which stands for Concertation des luttes contre l'exploitation sexuelle, which is a frontline organization. We work with women who are in prostitution or have exited, who are struggling to exit prostitution. We also work to change the mentalities. We believe in a world free from prostitution. And we do some training also and work with schools and wherever they will invite us or where we want to go to bring some challenges to the myths surrounding prostitution and women's sexuality in general. I'm also the president of CAP International. CAP is for the Coalition of the Abolition of Prostitution International, of whom many of the speakers here are members. CAP is also a frontline groups organization. We have 30 members in 26 countries around the world. And we are at the forefront of what it means for women to be considered as expendable and buyable and rejectable. And so we work also as CAP International to bring about more advocacy for changing the laws and the policies surrounding prostitution in all of our countries. If we look at the situation here in Canada, we're in a situation where the law that we have right now is like an hybrid of the Nordic model, a bad one, really. But still, we can be considered as buying sex is criminal in Canada. But it's about just the only thing that is good about our law. Everything else is bad because they still the police can criminalize and do criminalize women for soliciting in certain areas in the country or their cities, and they actually do not enforce the law in any way, shape, or form, or it's very varied from one end of the country to the other. What's important to know is that bad law that we have, or that hybrid model that we have, came upon got decided or adopted because of a constitutional challenge from the pro-prostitution lobby here in Canada that had been working for many, many years to try to bring the idea that prostitution is work as any other. And one way that they had decided to do was to challenge the articles in our criminal code that were about soliciting and about buying or criminalizing pimps and so on and so forth. And so it went up to our Supreme Court. It was the challenge was accepted as the appeal court as being unconstitutional, and then it went to the Supreme Court, who decided also that it was unconstitutional and gave a year to the government, the Canadian government, to change their law, and especially to change the aims of the law. And at that moment, we had a conservative government that was in power. And of course, the conservative government, many inside the party and the government didn't want to really say that prostitution that women in prostitution should not be criminalized, because as we know, they come at this very often, they come at this subject of prostitution more from a moralistic perspective. And so they wanted to, they were able to concede, they were ready to concede that not all women should be criminalized, but they kept very tight on the idea that we could not totally decriminalize women who were selling their own sexual acts. So we have a law that is what it is, but it has been from top down, really, because it was at the top that it was changed. Of course, because we were there, we formed at that period, we formed a coalition of women against for the abolition of prostitution here in Canada. And we were able to do some presentation in the courts, but also to influence the parliamentarians in order to get a law that resembles the Nordic model, but we were not successful in bringing about a full equality model to Canada. And the reason for that is, there's many reasons. I think that first of all, like in other countries around the world, the feminist movement is not totally on board, to be gentle, to be nice, on the question of the abolition of prostitution. And we have over the years, with the neoliberal agenda and all kinds of situations, grown apart from one another as feminists in Canada. So we have to make sure that that was one of the impact of having a top decision, because we didn't have the movement really, and the strategy and the grassroots movement in order to go further than what we were able to achieve. The other thing is also that the way that legislative change happened in Canada is that we have the federal level and the provincial level. The federal level is responsible for the criminal code, but the provinces are responsible for the implementation of the laws. And since the federal level didn't put really, or didn't invite anything else than just the changes in the criminal code, they did reserve a little bit of funding for organizations like CLEAT, and I'm part of, but nothing really structurally important to change the mentality, to change the attitude of the society, Canadian society, on the question of prostitution. So we are stuck with a law that is not implemented, that is really misunderstood, really, that is not, most of the people in Canada don't know what the law is exactly. Some people think that prostitution is now legal in Canada. Some people think that it's not legal, that anyone can be criminalized. So it's all over the place. And it's the result, of course, of this, because we were in a pressure cooker to prevent the Supreme Court to decide that prostitution was just work as any other. There was no thoughtful process that brought us about how to change the reality and change the law, but have a law that is actually a comprehensive law that touches more parts of why women end up in prostitution and why men should be prevented from buying sexual acts. So we have been in certain provinces, there has been some work from feminists and from police forces there that have been showing us that it could be possible to have something that is much more closer to the Nordic model. For example, here in Quebec, we were successful, actually prior to the law in 2014, we had policy that was adopted by the National Assembly here in Quebec that recognizes prostitution as violence against women, which is a good thing to start with. But at the same time, also here, there was no, even when the law from the federal level arrived, there was no understanding from the provincial government, the Quebec government, on how we should implement this law in Quebec. They let the police do what, more or less what they wanted. And then we had also the government decided, the provincial government decided to have strategy to end sexual violence that included sexual exploitation, that once again recognizes prostitution as a form of violence against women. But that strategy has very little handles, let's say, to really come with real changes, which is, and of course now we have changed. We had a government change in 2 years ago. We have a more like center-right government that is there now, and last year they put on our table a commission against prostitution of minors, bringing us backwards with the understanding that prostitution, no matter if you're minor or not, is violence against women. And that commission is about to give their report further this week, actually on Thursday. And we're kind of wary about what they will force us to do, because we're afraid that we're not getting closer to have a more coherent vision about how we go about ending prostitution if we agree that this is violence against women. But I think that if we look at more at the pan-Canadian level, we have to really think of how we can go back and reappropriate ourselves of the struggle that needs to be coming up. Because I think we have most of the population in Canada, surely here in Quebec, more or less agree with us, or at least they do think that prostitution is not something that they want their brothers or fathers or sons to do. So then if we have something more concrete to offer, I think it could be possible for more transformative changes to happen, but it would have to be more coordinated among us, let's say. The other thing also that is very important, based on specifically on the notion of what the law has achieved, I think, is that the law in Canada has made prostitution a crime against the person. And up until 2014, it was a crime against the good society, good morals. Now it's clear that since 2014, it's a crime against a person. And I think that we have not used that change enough because it does call for a total change of the paradigm, even if you're with the police, but also with social services, with health services, it should have an impact that is much more structural or transformative than what we have seen up until now. And I guess if we look at what the opportunities that are there right now, I think that in some sense, at least here in Quebec, we have some opportunities coming up because the subject of prostitution has been for the last 4 or 5 years, or sexual exploitation, I should say more specifically, has been very present in the media, in the society, and some of the work that the government is doing. But we have to take this opportunity to go a little further in order to really affect more concrete changes for women and have, for example, the successes that France has had with their law in 2016, where it is accompanied with comprehensive programs to sustain women in to get out of prostitution, and to actually offer some concrete alternatives for women, because I think that we cannot dissociate prostitution from any other type of violence against women, but we can't also dissociate the fight for the abolition of prostitution from the fight to end the women's poverty and to the fight to end racism. So I think that we have to organize ourselves as much as possible, organize the women who have exited prostitution and offer them leadership in order to really get to a place where we are talking about the root causes of prostitution, that we're talking about the reality of prostitution and not the fantasies that some, whether it's within the university system or whether it's through media or culture or whatever, that they want to sell us the idea that women are, it's possible to organize prostitution for women to be in a better place within that institution, when we know that as feminists, these institutions, as I was saying at the beginning, are there to deepen and anchor the control of women's bodies and women's sexuality. That's it for now.
You gave a very detailed account of our current prostitution laws, and I think that's very important, because you're right that very few Canadians actually understand our prostitution laws, and I think in part also because of deliberate misinformation that's spread by the sex work lobby about what our current system is. And I think it's also really important to understand how the law came about in order to be able to kind of further advance that. So I really appreciate your comments on that. And there is a question that I'll ask you to elaborate on after we hear from Elisa, more about why we don't have the full equality model here in Canada, but I'll just put that on pause for now, and we can hear from Elisa about the situation in the United States and the work that she does.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been an outstanding panel. I've been texting my friends like, you need to get on Vancouver Rape Relief's Facebook page like right now. I am Elisa Bernard. I work at the Organization for Prostitution Survivors. I'm the Executive Director of Education and Partnerships there. We are primarily an adult services organization. We provide services to anybody, no matter how old or how young they are. I believe our youngest person who's ever come through us for services was 12, and our oldest has been 84. So we really acknowledge that impacts of the sex trade are a lifelong thing. PTSD is not something that just goes away once you get out, and the impacts are something that you might not see for many, many years later. So as I said, I live in the United States, where prostitution is, for the most part, completely criminalized. And to be very honest, there are many, many flaws to the approach that we have within our country, and depending upon where you live in each state. So the US has a very narrow definition of what trafficking looks like, and it does very little to address the kind of actual exploitation of what's happening to women within prostitution. Our trafficking laws really only apply if you have experienced force, fraud, or coercion by a third party, or if you are under the age of 18. So essentially, again, a third party has to be present, or you have to be a minor. And it's really important to recognize that I have not even talked about prostitution laws yet. I'm talking specifically about trafficking laws, because trafficking is federally governed. So that is something that is governed by our federal government, whereas prostitution is governed state by state. So when we talk about how prostitution is approached in my country, I can legit say that my country as a whole does not care about prostitution and the impacts of it. It cares about trafficking and the differences between those things. And I can say that that is there's a false differentiation there. So each state is responsible for deciding their approach to the issue and who will be held accountable for that crime and who will not be held accountable and who is punishable under this law. So in short, by distinguishing prostitution and trafficking laws separately by state or by federal government, we're essentially perpetuating the false belief that prostitution and trafficking are two very distinct issues, when in reality, we all know they are inextricably linked. And truthfully, I would argue the same thing, because poverty can make just as effective a pimp as any trafficker can. So to be honest, states don't actually care about this issue either, because truthfully, it primarily impacts communities of color, communities in poverty, indigenous communities, basically communities who are already at the margins. So state laws uphold this, and you can see this within evidence of this within these laws, because these laws are generally either overly vague or overly restrictive. And kind of further push those who are in prostitution even further into the margins. Often state laws are just vague enough that jurisdictions can, cities and counties kind of have to granularly get down into what they're going to and what they're not going to deal with. So what you end up seeing is state approaches that differ extremely drastically along the spectrum. So you can see places, depending upon generally how liberal they are, how progressive they are, and then how conservative or traditional, and that will indicate how prostitution is handled within that jurisdiction. And as we all know, within like feminist analysis and theory, that you would be surprised that some of the traditional conservative places are actually dealing with this better than some of the progressive liberal places. So like I said, each state can differ very, very, very drastically. And most states kind of poorly constructed overarching laws allow for really frightening analysis to come up in a city or county situation. So it's how you end up with places like the state of Nevada, where prostitution is criminalized, but the law is so poorly defined that you can have certain counties in Nevada that brothels are legalized, where prostitution can occur unhindered within, if the women within the brothels are considered independent contractors, which we all know from many examples that that is a terrifying way to do this. So in the same kind of countrywide paradigm that Nevada exists within, you also have states like my state, which is Washington State. So here we have sort of an almost de facto equality model, because our state laws are actually quite strong. So an example of this is that we've actually codified in our state laws actions that promote accountability through reparative mechanisms. So when someone is charged with crime of buying sex, they're levied a fine and a fee, and half of that fine and fee goes towards increased services within the jurisdiction that this happened. The other half also goes to increased police presence and law enforcement for the reduction of prostitution in that area. Now, the problem is the wording, because all of those things can be defined very broadly by certain police officers and agencies. So again, it's not perfect. It's a little bit better than some places. And unfortunately, for example, I mean, it's still completely criminalized. So women within the sex trade here in Washington State, if they are caught up in a prostitution sting, their fine and fee is $50. And I mean, frankly, you know, how are they going to go make that $50 to pay to the court? I mean, it's about as close to a state sanctioned as you can get without legalizing it in a lot of ways. And honestly, the state is kind of perpetuating it at that point. So just to be really clear, what I said around this is that you can be both a victim of trafficking under the federal law and a perpetrator of prostitution under state law. And that can actually even go further into county and municipal laws, depending upon where you are and which laws are surrounding you. So because of that distinction between state and federal law, it creates this paradox where you can be both victim and perpetrator. So you can literally be prosecuted for committing a crime that you are committing as a result of being the victim of another crime that is committed against you, even if you are a child, because most states still allow for children to be prosecuted for prostitution. My state just passed a law in February making it so that was not a thing anymore. So reality is like, even in progressive states like mine that are kind of getting this right, we're still doing it wrong. And then, you know, you asked a lot about like, how do we treat sex buyers underneath this law? Specifically, I would say that this is, they're treated with, I wouldn't call it reverence, but at minimum, they get respect. And potentially even deference in most places. And a lot of places, they're not even, they're just completely ignored. So like if you were to go to a police department here and ask, what do you call a sting on sex buyers? They'll say, oh, it's a reverse sting. So it's not even a sting, it's a reverse sting for some reason. So I want to kind of illustrate this with a couple of just quick stories. Was in Seattle, a cop high up in the police department was caught in a buyer sting. It was actually a buyer sting in a adjacent department to his, which just cracked me up. Shows the intelligence level, I think. But so I'm happy that we're doing buyer stings at all, but frankly, I'm not dumb enough to just settle for that. So again, this cop gets caught up in this sting, and the patrol officers were ordered to turn their body cams off. The officer was escorted away from the other sex buyers. He was allowed to go through an expedited booking process in a more comfortable precinct. So this is kind of how we are viewing, and it sends a message to the rest of the world on how we view this issue. Another example of this is that in the city of Seattle, our mayor actually just promoted a person to a position of power who is a convicted child sex trafficker. But women who have convictions of prostitution on their records can't even get jobs with the city as advocates. So, I mean, like, there's this obvious inequitable balance of how we are approaching this and how we treat everybody within this equation. So, I mean, to kind of give you a final example of how Washington State is trying to do this well, but not succeeding. Again, earlier I told you that there are fines and fees that are levied on sex buyers and surrounding crimes. Half of all those fines and fees go to services within the jurisdictions that those fines and fees were levied in. So the judges in Washington State, again, Washington State's pretty large. We could probably fit Sweden in our state. And the reality is that most judges are not aware of these laws or even how to apply them. And also within the state law, there is a caveat that says a judge can actually reduce the fine or fee of a sex buyer by 2/3 if he feels that it is financially inviable for the sex buyer to pay it. So to give you an idea of just how extreme, like, that is a great thing that we have this kind of reparative mechanism. But just to show you like how poorly this is actually applied, from 2015 to 2018, we could have collected $3 million in fees statewide from the prosecution of that crime. We only collected $1 million. So that's $2 million that were just left on the table, and half of that would have gone to services across the state. So I'm thinking about some of the prostitution units that had occurred in Sweden when the Nordic model first got brought there, implemented there, and how that could have adjusted how we deal with this, not just like in one part of our state, but in others. So again, like, Washington State is certainly not perfect, and we need to, I would be doing a disservice to the women who experience prostitution and trafficking in Washington specifically without acknowledging that this is a crime hugely based in systemic racism and poverty and institutional inequities. The majority of those who are caught up in the sex trade as sellers are women and girls of color. The majority of those who buy sex are predominantly white, upper middle class businessmen with an above average education and above average income. So we literally have our, our white guys are basically buying our girls of color. And we have to do more to be able to acknowledge that and also provide the exit services. I heard a lot of the other panelists talking about how the harm reduction models are the only models you're hearing. And like, I'll never say that you shouldn't do harm reduction, but you need to decide at what point does harm reduction look like promotion? And also at what point on that spectrum do you say, we also need to provide exit services, because just because you can make money in the sex trade, that is not an argument for the sex trade. That is an argument for like economic equality for women. So I think that's kind of like where I'll end. There are a number of different campaigns and initiatives happening here in Washington State and across the states, but I am not qualified to talk about like Louisiana because it is very different from Washington State. So yeah, thank you. That's all I got.
Appreciate the perspective from the United States, and also giving us such a detailed picture of how laws are actually applied, considering how complicated it is and how much we all need to even understand publicly in order to be able to have a fruitful conversation about how to actually end prostitution, and how difficult it is to even engage with the public when so few people even understand at all how what the laws are on different governmental levels and how they are applied. So more to that, actually, Florence's question to you, Deanne, was how come don't we have the true Nordic model or equality model in Canada? What is missing? What is missing?
A lot of things are missing, but well, first of all, what I forgot to say maybe earlier, that is that also in Canada, we do have, unfortunately, a law against trafficking on one side and the law that against sexual exploitation on the other side. And then there's a separation if you're a minor or not. It's different parts. There's no comprehensive law or package of law that treats that question of sexual exploitation or prostitution more specifically. I think it's important to understand that what we call the Nordic or the equality model has three components. The first one is total decriminalization of the persons who are selling their own sexual acts. And if I stick that with what I was saying about our law in Canada, is that it is to recognize that prostitution is something that is done to women, not something that women do. And that the prostitution is being done to them, to us, because by a society that refuses to put limits to men's entitlement to women's bodies and sexuality. So for me, the first component is that, and that is, we have to also think of the Nordic or equality model as a model that is not just about criminal law. It cannot be. The criminal law is not the only answer. It cannot be. Because we know as feminists for a long, long time, the law can go so far, the punishment can go so far. You also need to work on prevention, on changing mentalities, to actually confront behavior that is unacceptable before it becomes a huge problem. So if we stick with that first pillar of the equality model, Canada does not have an equality model because it still criminalizes women if they solicit in a public space where there's kids or near school or whatever. So it's the first example of how the model it's an hybrid model. I think that some people within the government, within the Conservative Party most probably wanted to go further, but that was the negotiation that they did that make the model flawed? You cannot say that this is an equality model if you criminalize women. The second component is, of course, criminalizing and penalizing the sex buyers, which goes along with recognizing that this prostitution is done by men to women or other men. And the third thing is also, of course, the criminalization of the pimps and the traffickers or any contributors to bring women and girls to the men, whether it's individual or a group of men. But the three pillars are also, as I was saying, they cannot, it's not sufficient to have a criminal approach only. It has to be a social approach. It has to be accompanied, especially for if we are thinking about decriminalizing women, it has to be accompanied with support, with money for them to survive, to have access to housing, access in a lot of parts of the world, access to citizenship, access to whatever permits you to, or gives you the possibility to actually realize what you want to do when you want to exit prostitution. And of course, I totally agree with you, Alisa. The reducing harm is important, but it's absolutely not the goal. It's only one of the tools that you have you should have at your disposition, because we know that it's not because women know that they would like, all women want to exit prostitution or will have to exit prostitution at a certain point, and no one should be telling them that they have to do it on their own, on someone else's schedule. But we have to be ready to accompany the women who are in prostitution and the ones who are in the process of exiting, or the ones who have exited but are still living with the consequences of prostitution. So a Nordic model or equality model would actually look at everything that surrounds this notion that women should not be criminalized or penalized for being where they are, and that we should work to prevent the entry in prostitution, support them when they're stuck in it, and help them exit when they wish to do so. And it's the same thing for the penalizing the sex buyers. The sex buyers, they have to know from different kinds of, all types of messages, social messages, repressions messages, that this is criminal. You're doing a behavior that is criminal. It's a practice that is damaging to women in general and to a society that wants to claim that equality or human rights exist in their society. So they have to hear it by all kinds of ways, whether it's publicity, people in power, by the government, by the police, they have to know that they have to stop that behavior. And of course, the pimps and so on, it's also the recognition that it has been, and I'm sure it's the case also because when you look who are the pimps, who are the ones who are organizing, selling sexual acts of other people to other men, they are very often men that have been trapped themselves in poverty and racism. And so we have also to look at because you're not born a pimp. Someone they have learned to be pimps. And so we have to also think of education and changing what brought some men to organize themselves and to sell and to treat women like that. So for me, it's always on both educational, but also what I call the social repression. We have to have a society that says, no, it's not acceptable. And we also have to make sure that we don't get in a situation, because we see that happening here in Quebec, is that you also want to distinguish the men who buy sex from the other men. So, which is a mistake, because the men who buy sex, they've learned it from somewhere. Their sense of entitlement is expressed this way for them, but there's also the recognition that man's entitlement in general in society has to be challenged.
So I can see from Noga that she missed the third pillar and she wants Diane to repeat what she said. From what I understand, the third pillar is the social programs and the social interventions, correct?
No, the social program have to be along the three pillars. The third pillar is really the pimps and the traffickers.
Mm-hmm.
The men who are organizing to bring women and girls to other men.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, yeah, I agree with you that the criminalization of men and the Nordic model always has to be intricately tied to adequate social programs and economic reforms. And Hilla emphasized this in part one of our talk, and I spoke about it a bit in our panel on race and class and violence against women. Currently in British Columbia, it is not possible to survive on welfare. Housing is incredibly unaffordable. There's been disinvestment in mental health services, and it's very difficult for women to actually be able to access detox and recovery at all, let alone effective, women-centered, trauma-based programs that actually give women a chance of being able to have an opportunity to fight against the addiction, and then also have a chance to exit prostitution that way as well. And you know, this year we've had 274 women die of overdoses in British Columbia, which far exceeds and the entire population of people who have died of overdoses in British Columbia exceeds the people who've died of coronavirus, for example. So very much right now, with the kind of policies that we have, women are abandoned and marginalized and in an underclass, and do not have the opportunity to even begin to exit prostitution because of their economic deprivation. So I have some more questions. A question to Gada, or I'm sorry, can you say your name? Is it Rada? Am I saying it wrong?
It's Rada.
Rada.
Yes.
A question to you and Ingeborg. Are there any groups or activists from other fronts who are your allies in your country, anti-poverty, anti-capitalist, like unions in Germany, or secular groups in Lebanon? What kind of alliances are you able to have?
Okay, I'll go, Ingeborg, because my answer will be short. As I said in my presentation, the movement is yet to be built. There is naturally, the organizations that are similar to CAFA working on violence against women issues should be the natural allies. However, it is not the case. And I think there's a lot of countries in this category. The natural allies are sometimes taking the opposite position. So we're not there. We're not there yet speaking about prostitution with unions or larger groups. The pillar is to gain the violence against women organizations, the feminist organizations, the women organizations, and from there start with other groups in the society.
Ingeborg?
You know, we have, I cannot list it now all the groups we have, but I would like to say a couple of words what happened this year in Germany. And it was a little bit different what happened in France, because the left-wing politician pushed forward the Nordic model. And in Germany, it's the opposite. You know, we have like the right-wing politicians who are for the Nordic model. For example, the political party of Angela Merkel. It's called CDU. And the women from the CDU voted for the Nordic model. So this is incredible what happened. Yeah. Also 16 member parliamentarians also said we have to implement the Nordic model, and out of the 16, 14 were from the CDU, also men. So we have a big trouble with the left parties in Germany. It's illogical because, you know, they are anti-capitalists, you know, they're not anti-capitalist, but they are, in their programs, they criticize capitalism and are, you know, they say they are feminists. So this is, you know, illogical, but the left parties are a problem in Germany. So we have groups, you know, inside the left parties who are really fighting now for years, and they're doing a good job. And I hope that they're getting stronger. Yeah, that's, yeah. The left parties and the left groups, they have to change, otherwise we will have no chance to implement the Nordic model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is something to say though about gaining some ground in Germany with some parliamentarians or legislators being in agreement with the Nordic model, since we know that once prostitution is so normalized that there's, you know, mega brothels across the country, it can be very hard to change the discourse as well as perception of prostitution. I have another question for Diane. The funding of anti-human trafficking police operations has led to over-surveillance of women in prostitution, which has led to more women being arrested for other crimes. Is that your experience? Is that true or false? Should I repeat it again?
But I'm trying to figure which money we're talking about. There's no anti-trafficking money as far as I know in Canada. What I was talking about a little earlier was the money that we got with the 2014 law that was to support women that were sexually exploited.
Mm-hmm.
Now we don't have, because that's I think that women who are in prostitution are across Canada and in a lot of places around the world they are being stigmatized and they are being surveilled, for sure, for all kinds of, from different sides actually, and for different reason. In my experience, I cannot see here in Quebec or in Canada, but especially in Quebec, we haven't seen an increase of women being arrested or being bothered. We have seen a diminution since 2014, which does not mean that women are not being harassed or are not being called all kinds of names. We can think of example, the situation of Indigenous women here in Northern Quebec, for example, but it's also true here in Montreal. Indigenous women who encounter the police, they will most likely be treated as a subhuman and be treated as if they are, well, even if they're not officially in prostitution, they will probably have to service the policeman if he wishes so, because he has total control of them. And so for me, it's not the funding, it's not the law that has created more arrests, because the numbers surely don't show that. It has created in certain parts of Canada, some organizations and some groups have worked with the police and like local coalition to actually put into places support for women that are interesting. But there is also a lot of work to do still, because the fact that women are being stigmatized in prostitution, and also by poverty, by by drug addiction, by being indigenous, just means that we have all the work to do to make sure that these women are the ideas that are superimposed on women's reality and bring them vulnerable, or make them vulnerable to either the policing, but also just anyone, any man specifically, or anyone who wants to abuse them. We have to work in a more broader perspective, but I haven't seen, and no one, as far as I know, has documented an increase in women's arrests since 2014.
More to that, actually, a question for all the panelists. Can you elaborate more about the connection between PTSD and addiction?
Yes, of course.
I mean, I can, oh, sorry.
We'll have Ingeborg go first and then you, Elisa.
Yeah, you know, when you have a PTSD, you have fears. Yeah. And to overcome fears, very often, you know, you take drugs. So this is a very close connection. It's a strategy to overcome your fear. Yes, I give.
Elisa?
Yeah, so a lot of the times I find that there's a certain amount of education that needs to happen around the relationship between chemical dependency specifically and prostitution. I think a lot of people are kind of operating from that preconceived notion that women enter prostitution to feed a pre-existing drug habit. And to be frank, most of the women that we serve, that is definitively not the case. As Ingeborg said, you are experiencing trauma. It's a coping mechanism to use a drug, to cope with that trauma, to turn another trick, you know, I mean, it's kind of like, it just goes in this vicious cycle of like, you turn a trick to pay for the drug, to turn the trick to pay for the drug, and it just keeps going like this. And I mean, of course, years and years and years of that, there's a definitive link between how people are experiencing not only chemical dependency, but also the stigmatization around that, as well as the experience of just being within prostitution itself. Some studies say that people in prostitution experience PTSD at twice the rate of returning war veterans. It's like 60-some%, and that's what we've seen here in King County and Seattle. I mean, and to go to that, it's not just the chemical dependency, like it's the poverty, it's everything else. And like over 90% of our intakes are on one form of government assistance or another. And as somebody said earlier, like in Canada, you cannot live on government assistance alone, and it's the same thing here. So, I mean, you know, when you're in this kind of structure, which is forcing you to continue, you know, engaging within prostitution to just survive, I mean, like this is chronic PTSD in really, really compounding situations. So, yeah.
I just want to add that in addition to the link between PTSD and drugs, what we have noticed as well through meeting women is that some of them got introduced to drugs via sex buyers, and some sex buyers actually request that the woman takes drugs in order to have the sexual act. So basically, they accept out of poverty and lack of choice.
Yeah.
Just maybe to add, it is our experience as well that we did a research in 2014 with interviews with 109 women in 6 cities here in Quebec, and it was clear that most of the women had started taking drugs after they had entered the sex trade, and not the other way around. And also with the question of PTSD, I think it's important to know that the consequences of prostitution in the lives of women can lead to PTSD, but it's not necessarily what every woman lives through also, because I think we have to be careful not to paint a picture that is, if you've done that, this is what will happen to you, and this is how you will feel. But it's clear that I think we have, and Ingeborg can speak more to that, I'm sure, but we have just looked a little bit, I think, in the impact of prostitution in women's lives in general, whether you are in prostitution or not. Mm-hmm. I think we have to look at this as well. Women behave in certain ways because we know that men can go and buy sex on the other side of the street. Women behave differently because pornography exists, and men are asking women to replicate what they see and what they want in prostitution or in pornography. And that is pretty much a PTSD situation, as I would say. And especially for me as an old feminist, it's especially troubling to see how young women are still dealing with that, even more than when I was young. Mm-hmm. About what, being objectified, being put in a situation where you have to be submissive, or at least look submissive. You have to accept what is being asked from you, from the men in your life, if you want to keep him. The pressure is immense. And we had different, when I was young, we had different type of pressure, but I think that we have to be able to talk also about the overall impact of pornography and prostitution on women's sexuality, mm-hmm. and women's lives in general.
Yeah, we had a talk yesterday, which you can access on our Facebook, with two of my collective members, Danny and Flo, specifically on pornography and how it's impacting women and their own objectification, but also what we see from our frontline work, working with women, and how pornography intersects with violence against women. We also, to this conversation, have a comment from our Facebook from a woman who is watching us right now, and she's saying, "Denial and substance abuse saved me and let me live somewhat normal life. Now at 60 years old, I'm ready to do the hard work to finally, hopefully, start to love myself totally." And I think, with anyone here in the panel who's worked with women in prostitution and knows the realities of what women have to deal with in prostitution, why you would become dependent on drugs and alcohol in order to be able to cope is only too obvious, based on what women have to deal with on a daily basis. Yeah, I have another question here. Are there any particular campaigns that you're focusing on right now? And are you successful in getting mainstream media attention to those campaigns?
I can talk a little bit about the media in Lebanon. Well, we of course have allies among media, because CAFA deals with other forms of violence against women, particularly domestic violence. Mm-hmm. What's surprising is that when we talk about domestic violence, even when we post something on social media, we receive a lot of positive comments and encouragement. Mm-hmm. When we post something on prostitution, the same people do not support our position. So when it comes to media in general, while we have some allies, but it's still very sensational. We published maybe 3-4 years ago a manual for journalists on how to deal with issues related to trafficking and prostitution, in order to exactly try to combine and see the interlinkages between trafficking and prostitution, because so far, and the case that I talked about earlier, the Chez Maurice case, which is an extreme form of, like, by the book, sex trafficking ring, it reinforces that there's a separation. So anything not related to like kidnapping, forcing, etc., is okay. And this is the trap for media in general. There's a lot of education needed to get out of sensationalism or the discourse that separates the two issues.
So here in the US, as I'm sure many people experienced earlier this year, there was a large problem with conspiracy theories being the predominant thing that was being pushed around the internet. People were holding like fake rallies. It was absolutely bonkers. And it was so hard because, as Shraddha said, it's based in this idea of sensationalizing the problem. And because of that, like, you know, we're now having my organization, which is a real organization helping real women who are really in prostitution and really being trafficked, are now having to compete with these sensationalized imagery just to get our voices heard. So we are doing a campaign. Actually, immediately after this, I'm jumping onto our own Facebook Live to do my own Facebook Live on a campaign that we're doing called The Life Unmasked. And we're talking about the experiences of women, specifically in King County, throughout COVID-19 pandemic, and some of the unexpected consequences that have happened and impacts of that. But to be very frank with you, media here in the United States sees prostitution and trafficking as one of two things. It's either a joke or it's a sideshow. And that's kind of it. There's very rarely will it be that you find a well-written, done article on this topic. Most of the best articles I've read on this topic in the last year have been op-eds by people I know working in the field. I think also, we can't deny the impacts that the kind of push for restorative justice has had on this understanding of like, how do we approach, prostitution, and how do we hold people accountable? And so there's been a lot of pushback around anything that has anything to do with criminalization at all. So like the media is glomming onto that. And of course, that's the progressive liberal movement, as everybody's talking about here, that's pushing that agenda forward. And so having to compete with that for media time that is unbiased and doesn't make us sound like a bunch of wacky people, because like that's what they're making it sound like, is like, oh, you're against restorative justice. And it's like, no, I'm not. I'm for accountability is what I am for. So it's very hard to kind of get that same messaging across in this kind of circus that is our side. And also we've had a bit of a circus here in the United States, if y'all haven't noticed lately. Very glad that's coming to an end soon, but it's been great. I hope you all have enjoyed the show,
It's hard to look at it, really. We have, the mainstream media is, I don't know, you can see good things and then the day after it's an awful article. So it's like hard to, there's no cohesion on how to address that question. For the challenge that we have, a little bit like I was saying, the commission that is going to announce their report with their recommendation this week was working specifically on sexual exploitation of minors. And it's clear that as soon as you say minors, you get very rapidly an agreement that this is, this got to stop. The challenge is really about presenting prostitution, whatever the age you have, as a form of violence against women, really on the same level, and talk in that sense of how we have to change men's behavior, but we have to change the laws and the policies around that. So that's the hard place. Sometimes the you know, the context will give us the possibility to put out a message, and the media will, some good journalists will take it and run with it, but there's nothing that it's really sustainable, let's say, as an opinion in the media. Even if we have very good allies that could put out some information, but it's not something that is really repeated in different media, mainstream media. We are using, like a lot of people, more and more the social media, because, and we just did a campaign that was rather successful against cyber exploitation, sexual exploitation, because like in many places around the world since last March, especially with the young, very young girls and boys that were approached on the internet for sharing pictures of themselves or whatever, any type of sexual exploitation. So we did a campaign that was pretty, but it was mainly in the social media. And a little bit, we've started also a few years back to buy, to buy some space in the public space as well to get out our message directly. So we had some, the bus stops where you have publicity there. So we bought, for our campaign, we bought in Montreal and around Montreal, the space, the public space to pass our message. And I think that that's probably where we have to invest, if we have money to invest a little more, is that doing our own messaging, because I don't think that any journalists will, will actually be able to sustain what needs to be, because there's always some challenges to whether it's coming from the left or from the right, challenges about our vision that prostitution is a form of violence against women.
Yeah, I think I can echo what you're saying, in that in BC, media is also not willing to touch the issue of abolition of prostitution right now. And so we've adapted by creating our own public education materials, including panels like this, in order to be able to continually produce and reinforce what we know the realities of prostitution are and what we actually want for women.
So if you want to hear something about Germany,
yeah.
The medias are, as Diane said, a big problem, because I really think, I mean, they report very superficially. And I think they support the sexual exploitation, not only of women, not only the pimps, traffickers, sex buyers in the state, but also the media. And I think a big lobby is also in there. Sex buyers are sitting everywhere. But we realized something nearly impossible in Germany. 2017, there was a reporter, who worked on it himself. I think he took a credit, and he realized a report about how prostitution looks like in Germany. And this video is shown, and he sold it to the second channel in Germany, ZDF. So the second biggest channel in Germany bought his report, and they showed it over and over and over again. I was also interviewed, and this made a change, this video. And then last year, the protagonist who was filmed in this video, her life was shown in a video, was filmed and shown at a time where more than 6 million people in Germany watched. And this was then, you know, this had such a big impact that, you know, politicians were starting looking at prostitution differently. So we had some success with the medias in the past, and since Corona, they are talking about this all the time now, also superficially, but they are talking about prostitution. It became a topic now, and something has to happen now. So this is the situation in Germany. Medias are difficult, but something is changing.
So we heard during the presentations from Ingeborg about how even though women in Germany are considered workers, they were abandoned by the state during COVID and not actually given any governmental support. So she gave us a bit of a glimpse into women's lives in prostitution during COVID. And as a last question before we wrap it up today, I'm hoping to hear more from panelists about how COVID has impacted the women that you work with.
So as I said in my presentation, you know, Corona showed what prostitution is and where prostitution leads the women into nothing. You know, suddenly, and the media reported about this, women stayed without any savings on the street, and the officers who were supported, you know, helping them, had no idea how, you know, to help them, because you know, they said, you know, if you don't want to work there anymore, well, do something else. Well, this is not helping women in prostitution. So it became visible what prostitution is, and on the one hand it was good, but on the other hand it was not good for the women, because, you know, they had no social security, they had no economical support from the state because they were not registered, they are homeless, and many women had to continue to work during Corona, and I don't have to tell how dangerous it was, and the sex buyers profited out of this even more vulnerable status of the women, you know, to do with them whatever they want.
I could go give a little bit of what we have experienced since March, and you know, there are different things that have happened. There's not only one thing, one pattern for the impact of COVID-19 on women. For some, rapidly after the pandemic or the lockdown happened here in Quebec, what the first few calls we had from new women were mostly by young women that were with a pimp and had succeeded in escaping or found a way to get away because the pimp was not interested or could not do anything with them, and they succeeded in escaping. After that, or at the same time as that, we had lots and lots of calls and messages from women who were already with play and women who have exited prostitution that were really in a state of deep anguish, deep fears, especially after 2 weeks, because at first it was supposed to be a lockdown for 2 weeks only, but then it went on and on and on. And the women were telling us, you know, that this was for them, it brought back memories of being trapped with a pimp or in a situation where they wanted to escape and they couldn't go out, they couldn't reach out to other people, and so on and so forth. So a lot of women who had relived trauma really during, and of course, adding to that the question of money, because of the, in the last year, for example, there's 160 women that contacted CLE. 100 of them were new women, and half of the 160 women are living off welfare, social assistance. And of course, not only it's not enough, but in the COVID period, the government didn't offer anything to welfare recipients to take into consideration the impact of the pandemic on them. And we know that for a lot of women, two things happen when you're on welfare and it's not enough money to survive. You actually go to community organization, or you go to friends that can give you some help, which they couldn't reach out for a little while at the beginning of the pandemic, or you find under the table jobs, or do things that gives you the extra cash that you need, and all of a sudden that was cut off. So a lot of lots and lots of economic stress, really, that women have been going through and still are going through. And also a lot of women that were still in contact in the sex trade in one shape or the other. They were telling us as the months were going by how they were harassed by clients. They were asked to offer more money to meet them in person. They were asked for things that they were not asked. They were asked to push their limit even more than they went before the pandemic. Of course, some of them, if they were in a bar or in a massage parlor, they could not go there anymore. So they were invited very often by the pro-sex work, actually, organization. They were invited, or the pimp proposed that they go for a webcam. They become the webcam girl. And so women were really, because that's a totally different thing. You have a much more, it's much more invasive. If you're on the internet as well, it gives you, you don't know who's got access to what's going on in the webcam, and so on and so forth. So a lot of pressure from everywhere, really, whether the women were still in prostitution, the women that were in the process of exiting or had exited, and especially women who, as we know, are living in poverty, whether it's before, during, or after.
Just a few words about the situation in Lebanon. Before the pandemic, there was, women in prostitution were put in a very, even more vulnerable position, because Lebanon in October 2019 had a severe financial crisis, and a large number of the population got poorer in a matter of few months. Got poor in a matter of a few months. So this has impacted obviously the marginalized group, among them women in prostitution. We have seen a surge of women coming to CAFA to get assistance. Because of the economic crisis and the COVID, CAFA went into a relief, some sort of relief mode. So we were like delivering food packages and cash assistance for some time. But then things, it seems that it went back to normal, meaning that women are back to maybe a usual rhythm of prostitution. The thing is that we don't have a lot of women coming to CAFA, so we cannot really have a bigger and wider picture of the entire population of women in prostitution. But that's what we observed at CAFA.
Yes, to everything everyone has said. I mean, it's just the exact same. We're experiencing so many of the similar things with regards to this. I think it's one of the most interesting communalizing, like community creating issues of our time, in that, people in Lebanon and people in prostitution in Canada and people in prostitution in the US and Germany are all experiencing the exact same issues, to a degree. So my state actually just went back into lockdown. So sheltering in place again, yay. The reality is this is impacting not just the women in prostitution, but also the organizations that are working for the issue here in the States. So I'll talk, because I think the rest of the panelists did a really good job of talking about what women are experiencing. I'm going to talk a little bit about just how the organizations are kind of bearing the brunt of this. So to give you an example, OPS is a very small organization. We have under $1 million operating budget. And last April, we distributed a little bit under $1,500 in direct client financial assistance. So helping with rent, helping with groceries, helping with utility bills, things like that. This April in 2020, we distributed 400% increase of that. So it's about $9,000. It is almost impossible to keep up with the extreme need right now. I think specifically with Diane, what you're talking about that there's not enough government assistance, so you go to community-based organizations, but we get our money from governments, but we also get our money from like private foundations who have responded in a very odd way of, some of them are doing great. They're like, oh, we'll do monthly emergency grants. And I'm like, that's awesome. And I have an advocate that I need to pay for next year because last time I checked, this will still be a thing next year. So it's kind of addressing that and understanding that within this specific movement, many of the people who work as advocates are survivors. Addressing their level of burnout and isolation. And I mean, I'm sitting in my parents' home right now on a webcam. My advocates are doing that exact same thing with their caseloads, which means they are like literally live streaming trauma directly into their homes. There's no separating work and not work space anymore. So I am really concerned with between those items, so funding and burnout, and then the increased number of women and girls that I'm seeing entering the sex trade or re-entering the sex trade due to loss of economic viability, or because of the normalization of specifically pornified images of girls. So one of the most common things we see is Instagram and Facebook photo swaps. And that is a completely reasonable way to make money as a young girl. And that is terrifying to me, because to me, that just feels like it's a very easy walk down that road through to physical prostitution. I see sugaring on that path as well. So the reality is like, we are seeing an increase in people who need services, and I'm seeing a decrease in funding, and I'm seeing an increase in burnout. I have a very, very real concern about our ability, not just ours, but all survivor service providers' ability to continue to provide this level of services into the future for another year. So, like I said, I mean, I think everybody did a really great job of explaining what's going on with the women, and also like, we all have things like services to run, and we need to honor that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you very much, everybody. I know it's been so hard to do the work, especially during the pandemic. That's been our experience as well. And thank you so much for speaking today and being here. It's been nice to be able to see you virtually. And thank you so much to our audience for tuning in. This video event will be available on demand immediately on Facebook. So you can watch tomorrow's event. It's at 11 a.m. Frontline Response to Women During COVID with Diane Redsky of Mama Wichita, Pragna Patel of South Hall Block Sisters, Jeannie Lorisoli of La Clay again, Megan Walker of London Abused Women's Centre, and my colleague Hilla Kerner of Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. So once again, you can watch live on Facebook or join over Zoom. And for all the details including Zoom links to each event, you can go on our website, rapereliefshelter.bc.ca. And we can see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, woman from Rape Relief and panelists.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rape Relief.